Hey folks, Keith here at Chicken Thigh Fishing. Today we are going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble a Silver Max bait casting reel from Abu Garcia. This is a very popular low-end reel. You can get these for around 50 bucks. You properly maintain it, can last you a long time. I have put this reel through the ringer, and I even handed it down to my sons, and they learned to use a bait caster using this reel. So it's been around a long time, and she's still performing very well. So can't say enough good about this reel for a low-end reel. Before we get going though, there's a few things I always like to say when I do my reel cleaning videos, things you want to have on hand. You want to make sure that you have some reel oil and some reel grease on hand so you can properly lubricate your reel. And you can get those at any sporting goods store. You want to make sure that you have a schematic of your reel. And the reason for that is it gives you a good picture of the components of your reel and the orientation and the description of the different components, and it just can be very helpful. I've cleaned reels on hundreds of occasions, and I still find myself referring to schematics from time to time. If you bought your reel and it came in a box, a schematic will come with it. However, if you bought your reel as part of a combo, say at a sporting goods store, and the reel came on the rod, you likely did not get a schematic with your reel. So in that case, all you got to do is Google it or go to the manufacturer's website, and it's pretty easy to download and print a schematic, but always a good idea to have that on hand whenever you disassemble a reel. I also recommend having your phone handy. It's a good idea, especially when you're new at this, to take a few pictures at some key points in disassembly. It's good to be able to refer to some photographs that you took along the way, so if when it comes time for reassembly something doesn't look right or feel right to you, you're able to refer to that photograph you took, and that may be able to solve a problem you run into. It's not a very difficult or complicated process. However, it can seem intimidating to take a machine like a bait casting reel and break it down to multiple small components. But I'm telling you, if I can do this, you can do this. And after you do this a few times, you're going to be an expert on it. Last thing I want to say is I always recommend working on a movable surface. You can see here that I am using a cookie sheet. I always do mine on a cookie sheet. The reason for that is it can take you an hour or so to break down, clean, and reassemble a reel. In that time, if you have to leave for any reason, if you've got kids or whatever, you get called to work, you're not going to want to leave those disassembled components out in the open on a countertop or on your dining room table, for example. You're going to want to have those someplace where you can pick it up and put it out of harm's way, go do what you need to do, and then come back and resume your project later. So I highly recommend working on a movable surface unless you're doing it somewhere where you're absolutely sure no kids or pets are going to get into it and you wind up having a missing part when it comes time for reassembly. Trust me on that one. So let's get going on this Silver Max bait casting reel. Now the first thing we're going to do is remove the palm side plate. Now you're going to hear me refer to the palm side of the reel and the handle side of the reel. It's pretty self-explanatory. The handle side of the reel has the handle. The palm side of the reel is the side that goes in your palm. So the first thing we're going to do is remove that palm side plate. And on this particular reel, you do that by depressing this spring-loaded rod here in the front of the reel housing. It's got a little ridge on it that you can put a thumbnail or a fingernail on, and you release the spring tension, and that will allow you to rotate the palm side plate, and once it's rotated, you can pull it off. Once you have that palm side plate removed, you can remove your spool. And that's all you have to do on the palm side for the time being, and so you can switch over to the handle side of the reel. Now on the handle side of the reel, we're going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and then the handle side plate. So the first thing we're going to do here is remove the handle nut retainer screw, which holds on the handle nut retainer, which secures the handle nut. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that screw. Now once you have that screw removed, usually that handle nut retainer will come right off with gravity. If it doesn't come off readily like that, all you got to do is take a small slotted screwdriver and kind of pry it underneath it and pop it off. Sometimes it'll stick there because of oil or dirt buildup. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the handle nut itself. Now one word of caution about the handle nuts on bait casting reels. If you are a lefty like me, that is to say if your handle is on the left-hand side of the reel as you're holding it, then that nut is not right tight, left loose. It's the opposite of that. If you are righty, your handle's on the right-hand side, it's perfectly normal. But on a lefty, it's opposite. So we're going to go ahead and take a 10 millimeter wrench and turn it to the right to loosen it. And all you got to really do is crack it. And once you crack it, you can remove it the rest of the way by hand. Once you have that handle nut removed, you can then remove the handle. Now underneath the handle is going to be a washer. If you don't see the handle washer right here on the main gear shaft above the star drag, it's because it's stuck to the back of the handle, which happens more often than not. The reason that didn't happen here is because I've already cleaned this reel and I didn't do a video when I did it, so now I felt like I wanted to do a video of tearing down this reel, so it's already cleaned. Typically there's dirt and oil in there and the washer will stick to the back of the handle. So if when you take the handle off you don't see it right there, it's because it's stuck to the back of your handle. You just have to peel it off and take it off. In this case, since the reel is clean, there's no buildup of oil and dirt, and so I'm just going to lift that handle washer right off there. Now the next thing we're going to remove is the star drag, and removing the star drag is a simple matter of unscrewing it. So we're going to turn it again to the right. Now you can hear that get past the click washer inside, and once it does, it should freely spin off. So now we are going to come to a series of washers here. And you're going to want to take these washers and lift up on the big wider one, which is a click washer. And it's kind of like a dish. And the other washers sit inside that dish. So I'm going to hold that together like a sandwich as I manipulate it past the threads on the main gear shaft. And so I'm going to be careful to keep these washers in order and in the same orientation that they are in, because these washers are curved washers here. They're not flat, and they appear maybe at first glance to be regular washers because the curve is subtle, but one of them is curved this way and one of them is curved that way. So you want to be careful when you take them out, when you put them down, when you pick them up to clean them, and then when you put them back together, that they are in that same orientation. Otherwise your reel is not going to work properly or at peak performance if those are in the incorrect positions. So those two washers go inside this click washer, which has a click spring in it, and there's no need to remove the click spring because you can clean that sufficiently the way it is. So now underneath that click washer, we're going to have another washer, which is the sleeve washer, and it sits on top of the sleeve. So we're going to remove that washer and then the sleeve. Now the sleeve, sometimes you can get it out at this stage by tapping on it or by prying it out, but sometimes it doesn't want to come out. Now that's not a big deal because you can take that out when you take off the handle side plate, which is going to be our next step anyway. But I want you to be aware of that, because if you happen to be moving the reel around and the sleeve falls out, you're going to know where it came from. So since it doesn't want to come out by tapping it, We'll take it out when we remove the handle side plate, which we're going to do now. So now the handle side plate, different from the palm side plate, doesn't have a lever to release it, or a switch, or a spring tension rod or anything. It is secured by screws. And in this case, on this reel, we have 1, 2, 3 screws on the exterior of the reel, and we have a screw on the interior of the reel. So we have to remove all 4 of those screws in order to remove the handle side plate. So I'll go ahead and take those screws out. And when I take them out, I'm going to lay them down in the same pattern that they go in, so I know which hole they go in, because typically on a bait casting reel, you're going to have several different size screws that have different lengths or diameters to them. And you want to be sure upon reassembly to put the right screws back in the right holes. Otherwise, you could, cause some damage to that opening. Okay, so now I have the screws out, but at this point, this reel is going to want to tip over because of the weight. So I always have a screwdriver handy that I kind of prop it up on so it doesn't do that, because when you take off the handle side plate, you're going to have components under there that could fall off, and if you're not familiar with this, you may not know where they came from, and you have to spend some time referring to your schematic. So I'm going to prop up the reel, and then I'm going to carefully remove the handle side plate. And when I did, it left the sleeve, and that's the sleeve we were talking about. It left the sleeve on the main gear shaft here. It'll either leave it on the shaft or it will be stuck in the clutch here, and in which case you just kind of poke it out. So the sleeve remained on the gear, so we'll leave that there for the time being, and we will set our handle side plate aside. And you will see that I put the screws in a pattern that they were removed on. And I know, since I face these screws in this direction, that these are the exterior screws, and that this screw goes here, this screw goes here, and this screw goes here. And I always take the screws from the reverse side of a bait casting reel and I face them this way, so I know this is the back screw that goes in the other way. And so now I am going to remove that sleeve. Now there's an important aspect of this sleeve that you're going to want to know, and that is that at first glance, both ends of it appear identical, but they are not. One end is perfectly circular. The other end has an oblong kind of rectangular shape to it, where it has 2 curved sides and 2 straighter sides. And it's a pretty subtle thing, but if you take a look at it, you can see it. The important part about that is this is a one-way sleeve, and it's only designed to be on here one way. So the side that has the 2 flat rectangular kind of sides goes up the gear shaft. The circular side goes down. So you want to be aware of that for when you put it down, because when you pick this up and clean it, you're going to mess it up and put it in different directions. So when it comes time for reassembly, you're going to want to make sure you put that on correctly. So now that we have that handle side plate removed, now would be a good time to take a good photograph, or a couple of photographs from a couple different angles, because it give you a view of the interior components in their correct positions on the reel. So in the event that you flip it over or something happens and there's parts that fall out or whatnot, you're going to know where they went because you'll have a photograph to refer to. So I always recommend taking a couple photographs from different angles at this point when you're new to this and you're not familiar with the components of a bait casting reel. So the next thing we're going to remove on this reel is the spring handle, the tension rod that holds that palm side plate in place. On top of it is a spring, so we're going to remove the spring, and then removing that handle is a simple matter of sliding it out. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to remove is the main gear and the drag washer stack assembly. And that's simply a matter of lifting it up off of the main gear shaft. Now typically when you do this, you're going to want to hold it like a sandwich like this, because underneath what are going to be stuck there are these 2 components here. But like I said, since I just cleaned this, they're not sticking with the oil to the underside of this main gear. But 9 times out of 10, when you remove a main gear, this carbon fiber washer and the ratchet that you see under there are going to be stuck to the underside of the gear, and you just take them out. So since they remained on the main gear shaft here, all I have to do is take the top washer and then the next washer, and then we have the next washer, which is a different material, and the main gear. Then we have this carbon fiber washer that goes underneath the main gear, as well as the ratchet. Now I want to talk a minute about the ratchet because it's very important. You'll see here that the ratchet teeth face in a counterclockwise direction. And there's a specific reason for that, and if you reassemble this and put it with the teeth going the wrong way, with them going in a clockwise fashion, your reel is not going to work properly. So I'll just take a minute to demonstrate that for you. The job of the ratchet is to engage with the kick lever. Now the kick lever is going to move when you depress the thumb release. And the reason I held that down was because I didn't want these springs to go flying. And so you can see right here where the ratchet engages with the kick lever, and that's what stops it. Now if you put this on incorrectly when you reassemble and those teeth are facing the wrong direction, and as you can see this way they're going clockwise, when I engage that kick lever, the teeth are not able to engage it. And so your reel is not going to work properly. You can see there that they will go right by it. So you want to be careful to understand that, so that when you remove this, and then when you pick it up and manipulate it to clean it, and you know you're going to handle it a couple of times, when you go to put that back on, you want to make sure that those teeth are going in a counterclockwise fashion when you put that back on the main gear shaft. Otherwise your reel is not going to work properly, and you're going to know it as soon as you put the reel back together and depress that thumb release lever. You're going to know it right then, because it's not going to engage, and then you're going to have to disassemble all the way down to this point simply to flip that ratchet over in the correct fashion. It's easy to do, and I've done it on a number of different occasions over the years. So just a word to the wise. So now the next thing we are going to remove is the pinion gear and the yoke. The pinion gear is this gold gear here, and the yoke is this red piece of plastic. There are two posts that the yoke slides on top of, and on those posts are two yoke springs. So we're going to take the two springs off, and then we remove the yoke and the pinion gear by simply lifting up on the pinion gear. And you will see the pinion gear has a narrower side and a wider side, and it also has a groove in the middle. The wider end of the pinion gear is the end that goes down. The groove is where it mates with the yoke, and it sits right in it like so. Now that may look dirty, but it's actually clean. What you're seeing there is a little bit of new grease and oil that I put in when I did this previously. So now that we have that removed, the only thing left we have to remove from this side for a good cleaning and lubrication is the main gear, and bearing plate. And you will see that the bearing plate is secured by two screws, and so we're simply going to remove those screws. And now if it helps you here to take a photo, it might be a decent place to take a photo so you can see the orientation of the bearing plate. You'll see that the two holes line up with the screw holes here, and then this little appendage here is curved consistent with the gear hole here. And so when you pull that off, you're going to want to make sure you don't try to put that on backwards like this or anything. You're going to want to have that curved piece of the bearing plate go up against the curve of the gear shaft hole here. So now this assembly here consists of the main gear shaft, this gear, the bearing plate, and a bearing, and it's all held together with an E-clip underneath. Now, if you choose to do so, you can dismantle this, take that E-clip off, and separate these parts, but you don't really need to in order to get a good cleaning and lubrication. So during routine maintenance, I usually leave this assembly as a unit, as a whole unit. And now that we have that removed, we're pretty much done with the handle side of the reel. Now, as you can see, there are multiple other components involved in this reel here, but we don't need to break this down any further in order to get a good cleaning and lubrication. If you want to take it down further, God bless you, but the parts get smaller and smaller as you go. So now we're going to turn our attention to the front assemblies here. And what we have underneath here are the worm drive assembly and the level wind guide assembly. And over it is what's called the hood, and it's kind of a little plastic piece of fascia that protects those components there. Now, in order to get to those inside components, we have to remove the hood, which is secured with a screw on this side and a screw on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those two screws so I can remove the hood. And now the hood is just a piece of plastic that pops on and off. It's thin plastic, so you don't want to manhandle this because you can break some of the appendages or ears that it has on it that makes it fit in there nicely. So we'll put that hood aside along with the screws that go to it. And as you can see, when I removed that hood, this pillar wanted to fall out. One of the ears on the side of that hood holds this pillar in place. So if you see that pillar fall out, I'm going to tell you what that is and what it does. The pillar goes through a hole in one side of the reel housing. It then goes through a hole in the level wind guide to keep the level wind guide in the proper position. And then it seats in a hole on the opposite side of the reel housing. So if that should fall out after you take the hood off, you know where that goes. So I'm going to remove that the rest of the way. And another thing about the pillar is that it's got a certain diameter for 99% of the rod here, but at the very tip of it, it's got a nub that's got a smaller diameter. And that nub is what sits in the opposite side of the housing when you put it in. Now you can only put this in one way because the hole on the handle side is going to be the hole that's wide enough for the whole rod to fit through. If you try to fit it through the hole on the palm side of the reel, it's not going to go in because that hole is only big enough for the nub on the end of it. So we're going to take the pillar out, and now that that pillar is out, you can see that the level wind guide is free to move around. However, it's not free to move left or right, and the reason is because it's still engaged with the worm drive. So in order to remove that, we're going to remove this level wind guide cap here. Now you can typically remove that by hand, but if it's too tight, there's a slot there for a slotted screwdriver. So I'm just going to remove that. And we're going to put the level wind guide cap there. And then underneath that cap is going to be a little metal component called the pawl. Now the pawl has two ears on the end of it that engage with the worm drive, and that's what allows the level wind guide to move back and forth across the worm drive as you crank your reel. And the purpose of that is that's what enables the line to be dispersed across the face of your spool evenly. If that wasn't moving back and forth across the worm drive when you cranked your reel handle, the line would be only on one section of the spool and it wouldn't be evenly distributed across. So all I need to do to remove that pawl is use gravity. Just kind of tap it and that'll fall out. And you can see here the two ears on the end of it, and that's what goes down and engages with the grooves in the worm drive. And now you can see that the level wind guide is able to move left and right because it is no longer engaged with that worm drive. However, you still can't remove the level wind guide yet because it still has the worm drive and the worm drive tube going right through the middle of it. And it's important to take these parts off because these are some of the dirtiest parts of your reel that you'll see when you clean it. You'll frequently find pieces of weeds and grass and all kinds of stuff in here because when your line goes through the line guide here, if there's anything on your line, it kind of peels off and you'll get a lot of that stuff gunked up in these components here. So it's important to remove these in order to clean them. So in order to remove the worm drive assembly so that we can remove the level wind guide, there are two sections. There are the handle side components and there are the palm side components. On the handle side, you have the worm gear, which is held in place by a small pin that sits down in a groove that's on top of the worm gear. Underneath that will be a bearing. On the palm side is what holds it all together. You have a plastic bushing here, this white component, and then there's a spacer underneath it, and then there's an E-clip on top of it. Now that E-clip is what holds that entire assembly together. So we're going to begin by removing the E-clip on the palm side of the reel. Now in order to do that, what you want to do is take a small slotted screwdriver, and you'll find that there are a couple of notches on the E-clip, and you're just going to stick a corner of the slot of the screwdriver into one of those notches and pop it off. When you do that, you want to be careful to cover this with your hand because that E-clip has a certain amount of tension on it which is keeping it on there. When you pop that off, if you don't have it covered with your hand, it has a propensity to want to go flying across the room. And if it does, good luck finding it. So I'm going to take my screwdriver and I'm going to get it in one of the notches. I'm going to cover it with my hand. And you can see that I just popped it off right there. There's the E-clip and there's the spacer that came off with it. So I'm going to stick the E-clip and the spacer over here, and then I'm going to remove the bushing. Now the bushing only goes in one way here. It's got a little rectangular nub on it, and you can see how it seats perfectly in the molding of the reel housing here. So when you reinstall this, you want to make sure that that rectangular nub is where it belongs. So that's just a matter of popping that out. And then now once you remove that E-clip, you're going to want to be aware that that releases the rest of the mechanism. So if you don't have your hand on the other side of it, that can all fall out. Which is no big deal, but when you do this for the first time and you're not familiar with it, that might give you some worries. So what just fell out was the level wind guide because it was released from the worm drive tube here. So on the level wind guide, you have the top hole here, which accommodates the pillar. You have the larger hole here, which accommodates, and then on the front side of it, it has the lower hole that accommodates the pawl and then the cap. And the upper hole is your line guide, which is where your line goes in and out of your reel. So now we'll turn our attention to the worm drive here. And you'll see that there is that little pin that goes through a hole in the worm drive, and that's what secures the worm gear. So you just tap that little pin out, and now you're able to remove the worm gear. And now the worm gear, on one side of it, it has these two grooves in a cross section, and that's where that pin seats in there. So the other side is flat. So when you put that on, you want to make sure that those grooves are facing up so that pin can go down and sit in them. And underneath here, we have a bearing. And I can remove the worm drive itself now and then pop out that bearing. That bearing goes underneath the worm gear. And you have the worm drive here and the worm drive tube. So that's as far as we're going to disassemble in order to achieve a good cleaning and lubrication. And so what I would do now is systematically clean each piece. And when I do clean them, I use Lysol wipes or Clorox wipes of that type. And if I have a piece with a lot of corrosion on it or something like that, I might use a stronger solvent. But typically, cleaning wipes do the trick. They get them clean and they're safe for the parts, and that's what works for me. But again, I'm not going to clean the parts here in this video because I've already cleaned this reel, and the only thing you see on these parts here, it isn't dirt, it's the new grease and oil that I have put on the parts. So, we're going to go ahead and reassemble, and for the most part, what we're going to do is reassemble in the reverse order that we disassembled in. So I'm going to take my reel housing facing me, and the first thing I'm going to do is take the level wind guide and the worm drive tube, and I'm going to put the worm drive tube in on the gear side, the handle side of the reel, with the cup end on this side, because that cup is where that bearing sits in. But before I put it all the way through, I'm going to put the level wind guide on, because it has to go through the bigger hole, and then we can seat the other end of the worm drive tube into the corresponding hole on the other side. So the next thing I'm going to do is take the worm drive itself, and the worm drive has a hole in one end of it. You can see that hole on the end there, and that's where that pin goes through to secure the worm gear. So I'm going to put the worm drive into the worm drive tube with the hole coming out the gear side. Once that's in place, I'm going to kind of hold it in position like so, and I am going to be able to attach the components on the gear side of the worm drive. That's going to be the bearing that fits into that cup. You can see how it fits right into that cup there. And then I'm going to take the worm gear and I'm going to put that on top of it. And then I'm going to make sure there's enough sticking through so I can see that hole that this pin goes in. And then it's simply a matter of putting the pin in the hole and then making it flush inside the groove on that gear. Now that can be a little bit easier said than done sometimes because it's a small pin, and if you have pickle fingers like me, sometimes it can take you a couple of minutes to get that in there. Sometimes it goes right in. So I got it in there, and now I'm just going to manipulate it until it goes down into the groove like that. And so you can see how the pin is through the worm drive and sitting down in the groove on the worm gear. And so now as I do the rest of this, I'm going to make sure that I hold this in place, because if I don't, when I tip it over, it's going to want to fall apart. So now that I have that piece in place, I can go ahead and secure this side of the worm drive. And you will recall that the first piece is going to be the bushing. And the bushing has that rectangular nub on it, and we want to make sure that's in the correct position there. And then we're going to put that spacer on, and then we're going to put the E-clip on. And now the E-clip, we just have to get that into position. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab my little flathead screwdriver and get on the end of it there, so I have a little pressure, and pop it on like so. And so now the E-clip is holding it all together, and I can let go of the other side and it won't go anywhere. So the next thing we're going to do is install the pawl. And now remember that pawl has two small ears on the end of it, and those ears go down into the grooves and engage with the worm drive. So I'm going to put that down there, and then as I move it across, it will drop in, and those grooves will seat inside the those ears will seat inside the grooves on that worm drive. So now I can replace the cap, and now we can replace the pillar. Now the pillar, you will recall, has one end with a nub on it that is a smaller diameter than the rest of it, and it only goes in one way, and it's going to go in from the handle side of the reel, through the appropriate hole in the level wind guide, and then it's going to seat into the corresponding hole on the palm side. And you'll know you have that in correctly when that nub is right down in there and it's flush. And so you can see there, you can see the metal right there. That's the nub on that pillar, and it's flush there. And so we know that's in the correct position. So now I'm going to hold it upright, because if I tip it, that pillar can fall out now, because remember, the hood is what holds that in place. So I'm going to take the hood, and I'm just going to get that right in place and click it right in place. And now that pillar's not going to fall out. So now I'm going to take the screws that secure the hood and reinsert those. And so now we have the hood, the level wind guide, and the worm drive assemblies reassembled. Now, as I mentioned, I had already cleaned and lubricated this, so when I put that bearing underneath that worm gear, I would have oiled that bearing at that time. So now that we have those components, we're ready to turn our attention to the handle side of the reel. And I'm going to begin with that main gear assembly. I'm going to take the bearing and place it into the cup where it goes, and I'm going to make sure that that bearing plate is facing the correct way, and we're going to sit that down so that the yellow gear here meshes with the worm gear, and so that the screw holes are where they need to be. And you will remember the end of this end here, this curve goes right around the housing piece here where that goes. So now that I have that lined up, I will take the two screws and screw that down. And you can see how those gears mesh together. And you can see how that in turn lets the level wind guide go back and forth across the worm drive. So now that we have that in place, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the yoke and the pinion gear. And now remember, the pinion gear, the wider side of the pinion gear goes down, and we're going to mate the pinion gear with the yoke, and then simply drop the pinion gear in the hole and the yoke down on the yoke posts. There's two holes in the yoke that accommodate those yoke posts. And so we just put that yoke down on those yoke posts, and you're going to want to make sure it goes all the way down so there is enough of each post coming up to accommodate you putting the springs back on. Now you can put that yoke on upside down, but you'll know if you have it upside down because there won't be enough room for you to put the springs on there. So as long as you get those springs on there, you know that's in the right position. And so now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and begin to replace our main gear and drag washers. And I'm going to take the ratchet, and remember which way the teeth go. They have to go this way. And I'm going to drop that all the way down to the base of the main gear and make sure the teeth are facing the correct way. And then I'm going to put the carbon fiber washer, and then the main gear. And the main gear is going to go down, and you may have to tip it a little to get it to engage with the pinion gear, like so. Next. Next. And then this washer goes on top here. Now on top of that, we're going to put the sleeve. And remember, the sleeve has a perfectly circular side, and it has a side that has two straight sides on it. Those two straight sides have to go up. So I'm going to put the circular side down, get that down over there, and there we go. So now the sleeve is in place. So now here is where I would grease the outer edge of the gear and with a little bit, and I've already got some on there, and you don't want to put too much on there, so I'm just going to put a little extra, and that grease will mesh with the pinion gear, and those gears will be sufficiently greased. So the last thing we have to install here is the spring release bar for the palm side plate, and that simply goes through one side and goes in the corresponding hole on the other side, and that's got a spring that sits on top of it like so. And that will leave us ready to reinstall the handle side plate. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully put the handle side plate on, and there'll be just a little bit of resistance from those springs you'll feel there. So you're going to want to hold that together while you install the screws. And so I will take the 3 exterior screws and install those. And then when I have those installed, I'm going to go ahead and install that one screw on the other side, on the inside of the reel. And so now I have the 3 exterior screws installed, as well as the 1 interior screw. So now we're ready for these components here. And we'll put the sleeve washer down on top of the sleeve, and then the click washer and click spring. And that can be a little tough to get over the threads on the main gear shaft sometimes because of the shape of the opening. So you just got to kind of work that down and get it seated like that. Now we're going to take the 2 curved washers. I'm going to make sure we put those in the correct orientation. So now we are ready for the star drag, and that's just a matter of screwing it on. Now you got to be careful because the first thread can be tough to get on this because of the shape of it. It's got that rectangular shape, and you want to make sure it's on. And if you get any resistance like that, you know that it's not on correctly. You know it's on correctly when it spins freely like that. So you don't want to cross thread it. So then I'm going to grab the main gear shaft there and finish tightening it down. And then once I have that all set, I'm ready for the handle washer. And then the handle. Now I can put on the handle nut. And again, that's going to be opposite. That's going to be left to tighten it instead of right. And you got to get that first thread in, and you'll know you have it on correctly if it threads with ease. If you feel any resistance, stop and pull back on it and restart. And we're going to snug that down by hand and then give it a little tweak with our 10mm wrench, but we're not going to over tighten this. We're just going to make it snug. And we can put on the handle retainer, the handle nut retainer. And the hole on that handle nut retainer needs to line up with the hole on the handle, so you can put the handle nut retainer screw in. And if you don't have that exactly lined up, it won't go in. So if it's not lined up, all you need to do is tweak it to the left or the right with your wrench to get it lined up. So we'll go ahead and install that handle nut retainer screw. Now we're all set with the handle side, and we can turn our attention to the palm side. And there are bearings on either side of the spool to oil. I've already oiled those. And we're going to drop the spool in. And then our last component will be the palm side plate, which also has a bearing that needs to be oiled that I already oiled. And that is for the exterior magnetic brake dial. And so we're going to go ahead and take the palm side plate and put that in and then rotate it into place. And that tension rod, you'll hear it click and you'll feel it click and you'll know it's secure. So there you have it. Reassembled, ready to go, clean, quiet, smooth, just like new. Routine maintenance, will definitely extend the life of your bait casting reels. So if you learn how to disassemble and reassemble these reels, it's a lot easier than you may think. If I can do it, you can do it. Hey, thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing. We'll see you next time. Stay fishing, my friends.